every chocolate type explained. Milk chocolate accounts for roughly 70% of all chocolate consumed in the United States. It is also the type that professional chocolatiers consider the most technically difficult to work with, which is either ironic or entirely predictable depending on how generous one is feeling toward mass-market taste. The version most people grew up eating was standardized not by a pastry chef, but by Milton Hershey in 1900, who deliberately lowered the cocoa content and introduced a slight sour note, now called the Hershey process, by allowing the milk to partially liquefy before drying. Europeans who encounter it for the first time frequently describe it as tasting of vomit, which is medically accurate. The Hershey process produces butyric acid, the same compound responsible for the smell of sour milk. Americans raised on it experience this as nostalgia. Dark chocolate is the category the industry wants consumers to believe is ancient and pure, and it is neither. The term has no internationally agreed upon legal definition. In the European Union, dark chocolate must contain at least 35% cocoa solids. In the United States, there is no minimum. Manufacturers can and do label products as dark chocolate, while filling them with sugar, vanilla, and lecithin that alter flavor profiles substantially. The real distinction within the category is whether the bar is sweetened at all. True unsweetened baking chocolate, as sold by Baker's Chocolate Company since 1780, contains nothing but cacao mass and exists almost entirely as a cooking ingredient because eating it produces an expression most adults reserve for medical procedures. White chocolate is not chocolate. This is stated confidently by food scientists and disputed bitterly by confectioners. The EFTA defines chocolate by the presence of cocoa solids. The dark, flavonoid-rich particles that survive after cocoa butter is extracted from the cacao bean. White chocolate contains only the butter, not the solids, and therefore contains none of the compounds that make chocolate taste like chocolate. Nestle introduced it commercially in 1936 as a way to use surplus cocoa butter left over from military chocolate production, which means white chocolate was, at its origin, a byproduct disposal strategy. The EFTA did not even establish a standard of identity for it until 2004. Quality white chocolate contains a minimum of 20% cocoa butter. The rest of what is sold contains refined vegetable fat instead, which does not melt at body temperature and explains the waxy sensation it leaves on the roof of the mouth. Ruby chocolate spent years being discussed before most people had tasted it. Barry Callebaut, the Swiss-Belgian company that produces roughly one-third of the world's commercial cocoa and chocolate, announced its development in September 2017 after a decade of research and immediately filed extensive intellectual property protections around the process. The pink color is naturally occurring, derived from specific unfermented cacao beans processed at low temperatures that preserve anthocyanins, the same pigments found in red cabbage and blueberries. Barry Callebaut has declined to specify which cacao varietals produce the effect or in which regions they grow, which is either trade secret protection or competitive theater. Likely both. The flavor is described by the company as fruity and slightly sour. Consumer testing suggests it sells primarily on visual appeal, particularly among people who photograph their food before eating it. Gianduia is what happens when an economy collapses and a region's chocolatiers solve the problem by adding hazelnuts. Napoleon's continental system blockade in the early 1800s cut off much of Europe from cocoa imports. Piedmontese producers in northwestern Italy, working within severe supply constraints, began extending their limited chocolate with locally abundant hazelnuts ground into a paste. The resulting product, smoother and more unctuous than plain chocolate, was sold in Turin under the character name Gianduia, a stock figure from the local carnival tradition. Ferrero, headquartered in Alba, Piedmont, industrialized the concept as Nutella in 1964. Nutella contains so much sugar and so little cocoa that it cannot legally be sold as chocolate in many jurisdictions, which has not noticeably affected its sales. Gianduia in its traditional form contains a minimum of 20 to 40% hazelnut paste, enough that the hazelnut flavor dominates, and has been produced in the Turin area for over 2 centuries before the rest of the world decided it was interesting. Couverture is the category of chocolate that professionals use and beginners misspell. The word is French for coating, and the distinction from ordinary chocolate is entirely a matter of cocoa butter content. Couverture must contain at least 31 to 38% cocoa butter, depending on the type, compared to as low as 10% in standard commercial chocolate. The higher fat content makes couverture thinner when melted, which produces a smoother, thinner shell when used for dipping or enrobing confections. It also means couverture requires tempering, a precise process of heating and cooling to specific temperatures to encourage stable crystal formation in the cocoa butter. Or the finished product blooms with a grayish-white surface that tastes fine but looks abandoned. Valrhona, the French manufacturer that largely defined the professional market, began selling couverture to pastry chefs in 1922 from its base in Tain-le-Hermitage in the Rhône Valley. The decision to make the product available to professionals rather than only to confectionery factories proved to be the more durable competitive advantage. Bean-to-bar chocolate is the term the craft industry coined to mean that the maker controls the entire process from sourcing raw cacao through finished product, rather than purchasing pre-made chocolate mass from industrial suppliers. The movement expanded significantly after 2005, when Scharfenberger, founded in Berkeley, California in 1997 by a winemaker and a physician, demonstrated that small-batch American chocolate could compete with European benchmarks on flavor complexity. The comparison to craft beer is accurate in nearly every dimension. The same customer demographics, the same proliferation of regional producers, the same vocabulary borrowed from wine criticism, and the same quiet bewilderment among casual consumers about why something that used to cost $1 now costs $14. The practice of printing tasting notes on packaging, hints of dried cherry and forest floor, is genuine. Cacao, like wine grapes, expresses terroir, the environmental conditions of its origin. A bar made from Madagascan beans and one from Peruvian beans processed identically will taste measurably different. This is not marketing language. Single-origin chocolate takes the terroir argument further and has generated roughly the same debates in the chocolate world that single vineyard designations generate in wine. The claim is that beans from a specific region, farm, or even a single harvest express flavor characteristics distinct enough to justify isolation. This is scientifically supportable. Cacao is genuinely one of the most flavor-complex foods known, containing over 600 distinct volatile compounds, more than either coffee or wine. The practical problem is that single origin has no legal definition in most countries, meaning a bar labeled as such may contain beans from multiple farms within a region, or the claimed origin may be unverifiable. Serious producers publish harvest years and GPS coordinates for their source farms. Most do not. The difference between a $4 bar and a $22 bar is not always what the packaging implies it is. Ceremonial cacao is not a chocolate type in the confectionery sense, but has become prominent enough in specialty markets to require addressing. It refers to cacao paste or powder consumed as a beverage without added sugar or dairy, in forms approximating pre-Columbian Mesoamerican preparation. The Maya and Aztec civilizations consumed cacao as a beverage, not a solid, from approximately 1900 BC onward. And the drink was culturally significant, economically important. Cacao beans functioned as currency, and entirely unlike what the word chocolate now suggests to most people. The ceremonial designation on contemporary products is largely unregulated and functions primarily as a premium pricing signal. The underlying product, minimally processed, high-fat cacao paste, is real and does produce distinct physiological effects from theobromine and caffeine content. Whether purchasing a $30 disc of it from a Los Angeles wellness brand constitutes cultural appreciation or something more uncomfortable is left as an exercise for the consumer. Compound chocolate is the version the industry would prefer not to discuss in polite company. It replaces cocoa butter with vegetable fats, palm kernel oil, coconut oil, or hydrogenated oils, making it cheaper to produce, easier to work with, and measurably inferior in flavor. It melts above body temperature, producing the characteristic waxy sensation, and contains so little of the chemistry that makes chocolate interesting that several countries prohibit it from being sold under the chocolate label without qualification. It is used extensively in commercial baked goods, ice cream coatings, and the kind of chocolate-adjacent products sold near convenience store cash registers. The difference between compound chocolate and couverture is the difference between margarine and butter, the same general shape, entirely different mechanisms, and the gap in quality is obvious to anyone paying attention.